In September 1921, a wooden schooner named the Silver Wave departed Nome, Alaska, carrying supplies and a handful of passengers bound for Wrangel Island, a remote landmass in the Arctic Ocean roughly 100 miles north of Siberia. Among those aboard was Ada Blackjack, a 23-year-old Inupiat woman from Spruce Creek, Alaska. She had been hired as a seamstress and cook for a small expedition led by Canadian explorer Vilhjalmur Stephenson, who believed the island could support a permanent settlement and serve as a territorial claim for either Canada or Britain. Ada was not an explorer. She was a mother who had left her 5-year-old son, Bennett, in the care of others because he suffered from chronic tuberculosis and required medical treatment she could not afford. The expedition promised wages that might change that. The plan was straightforward. For young men, Lorne Knight, a veteran of an earlier Stephenson expedition, Alan Crawford, the expedition's leader and a recent university graduate, Fred Maurer, an experienced frontiersman, and Milton Gall, a young Texan, would establish a base on Wrangel Island and claim it for the British Empire. Ada would cook, sew, and maintain their clothing. Stephenson assured them the island was rich with game, that survival would be manageable, and that a relief ship would arrive the following summer with fresh supplies and rotation personnel. The 5 of them landed on the island on September 15, 1921. The Silver Wave departed shortly after, vanishing into the gray waters. Wrangel Island is a windswept plateau of tundra, gravel ridges, and ice fields. It lies above the 70th parallel, locked in polar darkness for months each winter. Temperatures can plunge below -50 degrees Fahrenheit. The island had been visited sporadically by explorers and hunters, but no permanent human presence had ever been maintained there. The expedition members built a small driftwood and canvas shelter near the southern coast and began setting traps and hunting for seals, walrus, and polar bears. Ada's role was domestic. She prepared meals, mended garments, and tended the camp while the men ventured out across the ice. The first months passed with relative stability. The men hunted successfully, and Ada kept the stove lit and the camp organized. They were isolated, but not yet desperate. Ada had grown up in rural Alaska, familiar with cold and scarcity, though she had never led a hunt or navigated open wilderness alone. She was quiet by nature, watchful rather than assertive. The men treated her with a mixture of courtesy and condescension. She was necessary, but not considered an equal partner in survival. As winter deepened, the darkness became absolute. The sun disappeared entirely by November, and the temperature fell steadily. Game grew scarcer. The men's hunting expeditions became longer and less productive. The initial optimism began to erode. By December, it was clear that the island was not as abundant as Stephenson had promised. The expedition's food stores were limited, rationed carefully but insufficient. They began supplementing their diet with whatever could be trapped or scavenged, foxes, birds, scraps of cached meat. Ada continued her work without complaint, though the isolation weighed on her. She thought often of Bennett, wondering if the money she sent was enough, if he was improving, if she would see him again. January 1922 brought the coldest stretch yet. The men grew irritable with one another. Lorne Knight, the most experienced among them, began to suffer from scurvy. His gums bled, his teeth loosened, and he became weak and withdrawn. The others tried to maintain morale, but the absence of fresh meat made recovery impossible. Crawford, the nominal leader, attempted to impose structure and discipline, but he was young and inexperienced in managing men under extreme stress. Maurer and Gall grew restless, arguing about hunting strategies and the best use of remaining ammunition. Ada kept to herself, performing her duties and watching the group dynamics shift. By February, the situation had become dire. Knight was bedridden much of the time, unable to contribute to hunts. The others took turns going out onto the ice, but the seals were elusive and the weather often made travel impossible. The small camp was damp, smoky, and oppressive. Tension simmered. Ada began to realize that the men were not infallible, that their confidence had been misplaced, and that survival was not guaranteed. In early March, Crawford made a decision. The relief ship had not arrived the previous summer as promised, and it was now clear that they could not survive another year without help. He proposed that 3 of the men, Crawford, Maurer, and Gao, would attempt to cross the frozen sea to Siberia, roughly 100 miles south, to seek rescue. Knight was too weak to travel, and Ada was not considered capable of making the journey. The plan was for the 3 men to reach the Siberian coast, find a settlement, and arrange for a ship to return to Wrangel Island. Knight and Ada would remain behind with what little food and fuel remained, waiting for rescue. On March 11, 1922, the 3 men departed. They took a sled, a small amount of food, a rifle, and a few other essentials. They left Ada and Knight with limited supplies and the promise that help would arrive soon. Ada watched them disappear into the white expanse. She did not know if they would succeed. She did not know if she would see them again. The camp became smaller, quieter. Knight's condition worsened. He could no longer walk without assistance, and his teeth had nearly all fallen out. Ada found herself responsible not just for cooking and sewing, but for Knight's survival and her own. She had no training in hunting large game, no experience navigating the island alone, but there was no one else. She began setting traps for foxes and checking them daily. She collected driftwood for the stove, rationed the remaining food with precision, and kept Knight warm and as comfortable as possible. Weeks passed. The ice began to soften as spring approached, but no ship appeared. No word came from the mainland. Ada continued her routines, moving through each day with quiet determination. She spoke little to Knight, who was often delirious or silent. She thought about Bennett constantly, imagining his face, his voice, the texture of his hair. She did not allow herself to consider the possibility that she would not return to him. By April, Knight could no longer leave the shelter. Ada was alone in her movements across the island. She walked the traplines, skinned the foxes she caught, and prepared the meat. She learned to read the weather, to recognize the signs of an approaching storm, to move efficiently in the cold. She was not confident, but she was methodical. She did what needed to be done because there was no alternative. In May, the ice began to break apart. The sea opened in dark channels, and the island became more isolated. Ada knew that if a ship did not come soon, they would be stranded for another full year. Knight's health continued to decline. He developed gangrene in his limbs, and the smell of infection filled the small shelter. Ada cleaned his wounds as best she could, though she had no medical training and few supplies. He grew weaker, sleeping most of the time, waking only to eat the small portions Ada prepared. June brought continuous daylight, but no relief. The food was nearly gone. Ada began hunting seabirds, climbing the cliffs to gather eggs, and shooting birds with the rifle. She had never fired a gun before the expedition, but she taught herself through necessity. Her aim was uncertain at first, but it improved. She brought down gulls and auks, plucked them, cooked them, and fed Knight what he could swallow. She ate the rest herself, sparingly, always aware that the ammunition was finite. On June 23, 1922, Lorne Knight died. Ada found him in the morning, still and cold. She had been alone with him for more than 3 months, and now she was entirely alone. She did not know what to do with his body. The ground was frozen too hard to dig a grave, and she lacked the strength to move him far. She covered him with a blanket and canvas, placed him outside the shelter, and continued her work. The isolation became absolute. Ada had no one to speak to, no one to share the burden of decisions. She woke each day, checked the traps, gathered wood, prepared food, and scanned the horizon for ships. She kept a diary in broken English, recording the weather, the animals she caught, the condition of the camp. Her entries were brief and factual. She did not describe her fear or loneliness in detail. She wrote what happened, nothing more. July and August passed. The island teemed with birds and occasional seals, but Ada's hunting remained inconsistent. She was not strong enough to haul a full-grown seal alone, and she had no boat to pursue them in the water. She shot birds when she could, gathered eggs, and ate sparingly. She lost weight steadily. Her clothing, which she had sewn and repaired throughout the expedition, began to wear thin. She patched what she could and continued. By September 1922, a full year had passed since the expedition's arrival. Ada had been alone for 6 months. She had seen no ships, no aircraft, no sign of human life. The weather began to turn cold again, and she knew that another winter was approaching. She gathered driftwood obsessively, stacking it near the shelter, calculating how long it might last. She set aside every scrap of meat, dried what she could, and prepared for the darkness. The second winter was harder. Ada had less food, less fuel, and no companionship. She moved through the days with mechanical precision, performing the tasks that kept her alive. She did not allow herself to think beyond the next meal, the next fire, the next trap. She thought of Bennett, but not in a way that brought comfort. She thought of him as a reason to continue, a fact that could not be ignored. Part 2. In the perpetual darkness of December 1922, Ada Blackjack moved through the camp with the careful economy of someone who understood that every action carried weight. The driftwood pile she had amassed during the brief summer months was her clock now, each piece burned a measure of time passing. She allowed herself a small fire twice a day, once in the morning to melt ice for water and warm a meager portion of food, and once in the evening for the same purpose. The shelter, which had housed 5 people at the start, felt cavernous and oppressive with only her breathing to fill it. Frost formed on the interior walls despite the stove, and she slept in all the layers she owned, wrapping herself in furs and blankets she had sewn and repaired countless times. The traps she had set in a wide circuit around the camp required daily attention. Foxes were her primary quarry, though their numbers fluctuated and their patterns were unpredictable. She walked the trapline each day regardless of weather, her rifle slung across her back, her movements deliberate and cautious. The wind on Wrangel Island was relentless, capable of erasing tracks and disorienting even those familiar with the terrain. Ada had learned to navigate by landmarks, a distinctive rock formation, a cluster of driftwood, the shape of a distant ridge. She did not wander. She kept to her routes, checked each trap, reset those that had been sprung, and carried back whatever she had caught. The foxes provided both food and material. She ate the meat and used the pelts to reinforce her clothing. Her hands, once soft, had become calloused and scarred from the work of skinning and sewing. She had no formal training in taxidermy or leatherwork beyond what she had learned as a child, but necessity refined her technique. She wasted nothing. Bones were cracked for marrow, sinew was dried and used as thread, fat was rendered and stored. The process was time-consuming and exhausting, but it gave structure to her days. By January 1923, the ammunition was running low. Ada counted the remaining cartridges repeatedly, trying to calculate how long they might last if she was disciplined. Each shot had to count. She could not afford to miss, could not afford to waste a round on a difficult target. She began to rely more heavily on traps and snares, devices that required no bullets but were less reliable. She experimented with different placements, different baits, learning through failure what worked and what did not. The cold was a constant adversary. Temperatures remained below -30 degrees Fahrenheit for weeks at a time, and the wind made it feel colder still. Ada's face, exposed during her daily walks, became chapped and raw. Her lips cracked and bled. She wrapped scarves around her face, leaving only her eyes visible, but even that was insufficient against the wind. She developed frostbite on her fingers despite wearing gloves, the skin turning white and numb before gradually recovering when she returned to the shelter. She knew that severe frostbite could lead to gangrene, as it had with night, and she monitored her extremities with anxious attention. The darkness affected her in ways she had not anticipated. Without the sun, without any natural cycle of light and dark, time became abstract. She marked the passage of days in her diary, but the entries sometimes blurred together. She lost track of dates occasionally, then corrected herself by counting backward from the last entry she was certain of. She spoke aloud to herself sometimes, narrating her actions to fill the silence. Her voice sounded strange in the empty air, and she often stopped mid-sentence, unsettled by the sound. In February, a polar bear approached the camp. Ada saw it from a distance, a massive shape moving slowly across the ice. She had seen bears before, always from the safety of the group, always with armed men nearby. Now she was alone. She retreated into the shelter, barred the door, and waited. The bear circled the camp, investigating the scent of stored meat and the remnants of Knight's body, which still lay covered near the shelter. Ada gripped her rifle, her hands trembling, and watched through a gap in the canvas. The bear lingered for what felt like hours, then moved on. Ada did not sleep that night. She sat with the rifle across her lap, listening for sounds outside, her heart beating hard in her chest. The incident forced her to reconsider her vulnerability. She reinforced the shelter's entry, stacking driftwood and supplies to create a barricade that could be secured from inside. She moved the remaining food stores closer to the shelter, reducing the distance she had to travel to retrieve them. She became more cautious in her movements, scanning the landscape constantly for any sign of bears or other threats. The island, which had felt empty and indifferent, now felt hostile. By March 1923, 2 years had passed since the expedition's arrival, and Ada had been alone for nearly a year. The isolation had changed her. She moved with a quiet efficiency, her gestures economical, her thoughts focused. She did not daydream or imagine alternative futures. She existed in the immediate present, solving the problems in front of her and preparing for the ones she anticipated. She thought of Bennett, but the memories had become abstracted, less vivid, as if they belonged to someone else's life. The ice began to break apart in late spring, and the sea opened once again. Ada scanned the horizon every day, looking for the shape of a ship. She had been scanning for nearly 2 years, and the habit was automatic now. She did not expect rescue, but she looked anyway. The sun returned, climbing higher each day, and the island came alive with birds. Ada hunted them relentlessly, shooting gulls and auks and gathering eggs from the cliffs. She was more skilled now than she had been the previous year, her aim steadier, her movements more confident. She killed enough to eat regularly and set aside portions to dry for the next winter. In June, she attempted to hunt seals more aggressively. She had observed them from shore, noting their patterns and behavior, and she tried to approach them on foot, rifle ready. The seals were wary and quick, vanishing into the water before she could get close. She tried different approaches, different times of day, but her success rate remained low. She managed to kill one seal in late June, a young animal that had hauled out onto a low ice floe. She shot it from a distance, then waded into the frigid water to retrieve it before the current could carry it away. The water soaked through her clothing, and she dragged the seal to shore with numb hands. The meat and blubber were enough to sustain her for weeks, and she rationed it carefully, drying strips over the stove and storing them in sealed containers. July brought warmer weather and longer days. Ada continued her routines, but she also began to feel the weight of time. She had survived longer than she thought possible, but the prospect of another winter alone was almost unbearable. She did not know if the 3 men who had left for Siberia had survived, if they had reached help, if anyone was coming. She did not know if anyone knew she was still alive. She wrote in her diary less frequently now, the entries brief and repetitive. She recorded the weather, the animals caught, the condition of her supplies. She did not write about hope or despair. She wrote what was. In August 1923, Ada saw a ship. It appeared on the horizon one morning, a dark shape against the pale sky. She stared at it, uncertain if it was real or a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and isolation. She had imagined ships before, only to realize they were icebergs or distant islands. But this shape moved, grew larger, resolved into the unmistakable silhouette of a vessel. She ran to the shore, waving her arms, shouting, though she knew they could not hear her from that distance. The ship changed course, moving toward the island. The vessel was the Donaldson, a small schooner chartered by the expedition's supporters after no word had been received from Wrangel Island for nearly 2 years. The crew had come to search for survivors, though they expected to find none. When they spotted Ada on the shore, they were astonished. She was emaciated, her clothing patched and worn, her face gaunt. She stood alone, waving, and the crew launched a boat to reach her. When the rescuers came ashore, Ada did not speak immediately. She led them to the camp, showed them Knight's body, still covered where she had left it more than a year earlier, and gestured to the supplies she had managed to preserve. The men asked her questions: what had happened to the others, how she had survived, why she was alone, but she answered in short, quiet sentences. She told them that Crawford, Maurer, and Gal had left for Siberia in March 1922 and never returned. She told them that Knight had died in June of that year. She told them she had stayed because there was nowhere else to go. The crew treated her gently, giving her food and water and wrapping her in clean blankets. They asked if she needed anything, and she asked about Bennett, whether there was news of her son. They had no information, but they promised to help her reach him as soon as possible. They loaded her belongings onto the Donaldson, along with Knight's body and the expedition's records. Ada took one last look at the island, at the camp she had maintained for so long, and then she boarded the ship. The voyage back to Alaska took several days. Ada slept most of the time, her body finally allowing itself to rest. The crew marveled at her survival, at the traps and tools she had fashioned, at the precision with which she had managed her resources. She did not seem interested in their admiration. She asked only about Bennett, about when she could see him, about whether he was well. When the Donaldson reached Nome in late August 1923, Ada Blackjack was met with a mixture of curiosity and pity. The press wrote about her survival, calling her resilient and resourceful, though some accounts framed her as a passive victim rather than an active agent in her own rescue. Ada did not engage with the attention. She collected the wages owed to her from the expedition's backers, a sum far smaller than she had been promised, and used it to travel to Seattle, where Bennett was being cared for in a hospital. Bennett had improved somewhat during her absence, though his tuberculosis remained a chronic condition. Ada stayed with him, working odd jobs to pay for his continued care. She did not speak often about Wrangel Island. When asked, she described the facts plainly: the cold, the isolation, the work of survival, but she did not elaborate. She did not frame her experience as heroic or tragic. She had done what was necessary, and now it was over. The 3 men who had left for Siberia were never found. Search parties scoured the region for years, but no trace of Crawford, Maurer, or Gal was discovered. It is assumed they perished on the ice, either from exposure, starvation, or drowning when the ice broke apart. Ada Blackjack was the sole survivor of the 1921 Wrangel Island expedition. She lived the rest of her life quietly, moving between Alaska and the Pacific Northwest, working as a seamstress and caretaker. She avoided interviews and refused offers to write about her experience. She raised Bennett until his death from tuberculosis in 1933, and she continued working until her own health began to fail. Ada Blackjack died in 1983 at the age of 85, largely forgotten by the public that had once marveled at her survival. Her story is one of endurance measured not in dramatic moments but in the accumulation of small, deliberate actions. She did not overcome the Arctic through strength or daring. She survived because she adapted, because she learned, and because she refused to stop moving forward. The island did not care whether she lived or died, and she understood that. She made herself useful to her own survival, and in doing so, she outlasted the cold, the hunger, the isolation, and the indifference of the world around her.